Ukraine, a country in the field of tension between East and West. Nationalists marching for the unity of their ruptured nation. For many, only the memories of past heroes remain.
The formation of the state of Ukraine is a tragic story spanning centuries. The Ukrainians have always been a pawn in the games of other powers.
The same applies to Poland. More than 100 years ago, the nation has to defend its sovereignty in bloody struggles, a period which to this day is firmly anchored in the collective memory.
Back then, it was the Poles who defended Europe against the Red Plague.
Towards the end of World War I, the first geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, there is growing hope in Eastern Europe for independence and freedom. The Versailles Peace Conference is supposed to create a new world order and self-determination. But the victors of the war underestimate the dramatic consequences for a region that is heading out of control. The Allies have taken on a mammoth task.
We're talking about radical changes to the map, and at the same time, the creation of new states.
That was a problem, and that's why you got all these conflicts. And again, there was a feeling that if we don't grab the land now, we won't get it.
The former Kingdom of Poland is now a republic. Czechoslovakia is formed. All over Eastern Europe, a spirit of optimism reigns. But the war doesn't end with the armistice. For 10 years, the German historian Robert Gerwart investigated the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. His conclusion: the treatment of the defeated nations of the First World War led almost inevitably to military conflicts that still endure today, with countless casualties, displacements, and irreconcilable hatred. Here too, Germany is not without blame, and the terms of the Versailles Treaty after the First World War changed the world forever.
Both in Eastern Europe, where the end of the First World War is linked in people's minds with national independence, and in the Middle East, the significance of this period cannot be underestimated. I think it's important to understand that in order to better analyze conflicts in the region today.
November 1918. In the USA, there is great celebration at the end of the First World War. For a long time, Americans wanted to have nothing to do with the conflict in faraway Europe. Now the USA has risen to become a superpower. At the same time, the peoples of Eastern Europe have aspirations of a very different kind. They're hoping for freedom, independence, and the end of the imperialistic paternalism of the three empires of Germany, Russia, and Austro-Hungary. The negotiators at Versailles thus have a great number of differing interests to reconcile. They are almost bound to fail. For the following months, from January 1919 onwards, Paris becomes the capital of the world. The victors have set themselves an almost unachievable goal: a peace that will put an end to war in future. And the many people taking part in the proud and peaceful parades in the French capital in 1919 also believe in this goal.
In Paris, after the First World War, I think that things are viewed fairly optimistically. In other words, the people said we fought so hard against each other, we injured each other so badly, now let's try and make sure things go better.
One of the extraordinary things about the Paris Peace Conference, and it will never be repeated, was that the world's leaders met in one place for 6 months. It's unimaginable today. When they meet now, it's at the most for about 2.5 days. And that's so heavily choreographed. You wonder if they have any chance to talk informally. Whereas in Paris, for 6 months, they had tea together, they met in the mornings, they met in the afternoons, they'd sometimes have dinner together, they would chat. And so you had an extraordinary relationship built up among these world leaders.
The peace plan is designed to regulate everything in the smallest detail: the formation of states, relinquishment of territory, and redrawing of borders. Dictating the terms are the so-called Big Three: France, Great Britain, and the USA. As the defeated nation, Germany isn't even at the table.
One has to put oneself in the position of those taking part. The biggest military conflict in history had just come to an end. Nationalist passions had been aroused in all the countries involved, along with certain expectations that they had of the peace.
The American president, Woodrow Wilson, has his own ideas of how a lasting peace can be achieved. He has a vision of a very big solution.
The main thing that had to be considered was how different nations, different languages, different religions could better understand each other.
And so Wilson developed his famous 14-point plan, in which he defined the goals of a new world order. The central point was the right to self-determination for all peoples, an approach that met with great enthusiasm in Eastern Europe and yet would create unforeseen conflicts.
Basically, there is something in 1918-1919 that is described as a Wilsonian moment. Woodrow Wilson's promise that the principle of national self-determination would dominate the future peaceful world order. He wants Czechs and Poles to take their own destiny in their hands.
Both peoples had suffered hugely in the past under the domination of Germany, Russia and the Habsburg monarchy. The former empire's territories should now give way to smaller nation-states, a liberal approach driven by strategic interests of the victorious powers.
The most important region was Eastern Central Europe. Here, it was a matter of creating states that would form a counterweight to a potentially reinvigorated Germany, in particular Czechoslovakia or Poland.
On the other hand, they should also be bastions against communism, against a Russia which might develop into a communist state.
The Polish delegation in Versailles know they have a major role to play in the future of Eastern Europe. And now the Big Three finally grant the new state, after more than a century of foreign rule, the long-desired status of a republic.
Poland was one of the great causes of the 19th century. I think there was a feeling that the Poles had been very unjustly divided up among Prussia, Austria and Russia. And the Poles themselves had a very strong sense of who they were, and there were repeated rebellions, repeated uprisings in the course of the 19th century when the Poles would try and regain their independence.
Europe before the First World War. The Polish nation is in the grip of the three empires. While Germany prospers economically, the problems of the vast Tsarist empire cannot be overlooked. Russia is facing huge upheavals. Nicholas II has blocked social and economic reforms and political change for too long. He has been contemptuous of parliaments. The military is his pride and joy. He rarely thinks of his people.
I think it can be said that Russia had for decades been on fire on the inside and had burnt itself out. The huge social problems hadn't been solved. Even after abolishing serfdom in the middle of the 19th century, enormous social problems remained in an empire of many nationalities.
When the First World War breaks out, the teetering Tsarist empire fights on the side of France and Great Britain against the Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. All the warring parties expect a quick victory. But when, after a few successes on the Western Front, German troops get bogged down in devastating trench warfare, it is clear that the slogan, "Christmas in Paris," is not going to be fulfilled. A war of attrition begins, the like of which has never been seen before. There are no further territorial gains, only shells that rain down on the soldiers in the trenches. In the east, the Tsar's troops are quickly forced into the defensive. In any case, the fighting spirit of the stricken empire's army is anything but strong. And it's not only the soldiers who suffer.
In the First World War, Russia was one of the warring parties, meaning that the country suffered more than it had ever before. Millions and millions of dead, not only soldiers, but also civilians who simply starved.
From now on, hunger becomes a part of everyday life in Russia. There are outbreaks of civil unrest, with the population protesting against the war and the Tsar. In the spring of 1917, revolution erupts. Nicholas II is deposed and arrested. Germany, Russia's opponent, sees an opportunity.
For the German imperial government and the military, with the entry of the USA into the war on the Western Front, it was enormously important in 1917 to keep things on the Eastern Front calm. They tried everything to transfer as many troops as possible away from the East. And to this end, they deployed a very special weapon, a weapon called Lenin.
Und diese Waffe hieß Lenin.
Using money and logistics, the German Empire smuggles the communist Lenin from his exile in Switzerland into Russia. Here he is supposed to start a second revolution and bring the war to an end. This act of desperation will change the world forever. The plan works. Lenin comes to power by means of a putsch, and now the Russian population wants peace at last. That was the big promise made by the Bolsheviks.
So for Lenin, it was a question of securing power, more or less at any price, which is why he agreed to peace negotiations with the German Empire.
The Germans have all the cards in their hand. At the negotiations in Brest-Litovsk, they dictate their demands to Lenin. The Bolsheviks' hands are tied. For Russia, the war is over, but the price they pay is immense.
The peace terms are for Russia more dramatic and more disadvantageous than those at Versailles for Germany. They have to relinquish large portions of the country, amounting to a third of their European territory,
including parts of the Baltic and Eastern Europe. The Central Powers occupy the formerly Tsarist territories. But these gains cannot help Kaiser Wilhelm II to win the war. Bringing the Eastern Front relief does not result in the success Germany has hoped for. During the course of 1918, it becomes clear that the Central Powers are going to lose the war. All the warring parties are exhausted. Millions of soldiers are dying in the relentless trench warfare. As the last hopes of victory ebb away, Germany declares itself ready to observe a ceasefire. A period of massive upheavals begins. The joy at the end of this terrible war is mixed with hope for independence in peoples who had hitherto been dictated to by imperial powers.
Many from the movements for autonomy, but also from national political organizations, now saw an opportunity approaching to found their own nations.
The empires are crumbling. Finland had declared its independence back in 1917, followed by the Baltic States. Poland and Czechoslovakia declare themselves new republics, as do many other nations in the chaos of the post-war years, but there are as yet no clear borders.
One of the problems with the collapse of the empires was that as these new nations emerged, or old nations like Poland emerged, they were staking out their claims, and of course they could all claim large amounts of land, often overlapping claims, because history had meant that, at one point Poland had been huge and then it had shrunk and then Ukraine had been this size. And so that was a problem. And that's why you got all these conflicts. And again, there was a feeling that if we don't grab the land now, we won't get it.
For the delegations in Paris, this means satisfying widely diverging demands from very different nations. Irresolvable problems arise. Thus, the then British Minister of War, Winston Churchill, foresees the coming events with the words, "When the war of the giants is over, the war of the pygmies will begin." And the victorious powers will be unable to prevent these conflicts.
The Allies represented some of the most powerful countries in the world, and they had, of course, huge armed forces. But as soon as the war ended, their interest and the interest of their publics was in diminishing those armed forces, demobilizing the soldiers. And so the Allied power, while it looked great, in fact was dwindling. It was shrinking the whole way through the Paris Peace Conference. And there was no public appetite to send masses of troops off into what they saw as obscure parts of the world and get involved in local conflicts. I think it would have been very difficult for the Allies to prevent all the wars that broke out.
Russia is still far from at peace. On the contrary, the revolution has been successful, but the population is deeply divided. During this period, the Red Army sets about redrawing borders. This leads to military conflicts in almost all of Eastern Europe.
Für Russland waren natürlich die
The
gewaltigen
vast
Gebiete
areas that had once been part of the Russian Empire and that now had to be relinquished under the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk were in the eyes of the Russians a region or regions that had always been, if not directly the homeland, at the very least a part of Russia.
zum Russischen Reich gehört hatten.
In the years immediately after the war, it was a matter of redrawing the borders in this area of imperial disintegration. And very often the borders were redrawn in blood.
For example, in the Baltic, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania collapse into civil war. The Red Army advances. From Germany, so-called volunteer corps, former soldiers from the First World War, arrive to defend German interests. And the victorious powers have no answers. But regular German troops are still based in Europe, and now they should help out.
Yes, a very strange situation arises in that the German troops not only aren't withdrawn, but are instead involved in combat against both local Bolshevik units and, in certain cases, against the Red Army.
Gegebenenfalls gegen die Rote Armee. Das heißt also, weil
So, because Great Britain and France have no troops in any strength in Eastern and Central Europe, they have to rely on the help of their former enemies.
auf den ehemaligen Gegner verlassen. Die Furcht,
The fear that the Russian Revolution will spread westwards is felt very strongly. Today, of course, we know that the danger was much smaller than was presumed at the time, and that the strength of the communist movement was clearly overestimated.
kommunistische Bewegung deutlich überschätzt wurde zur damaligen Zeit.
Lenin has not yet achieved power in all of Russia. The Bolsheviks' opponents, the so-called Whites, are still fighting the Red Army. From time to time, the revolutionaries are really up against it, which makes the fighting all the fiercer. The slaughter continues, and it expands to become a civil war that knows no bounds. Lenin is prepared to use any means necessary to cement his fragile grip on power. The country is overrun by dehumanized terror.
Dieser Massenterror begann.
This mass terror begins immediately after the founding of the Extraordinary Commission called the Cheka, the precursor, if you will, of the KGB, which relentlessly persecuted dissidents and members of the opposition. And it ends quickly with the beginning of the Civil War, which is in turn fought with a hitherto unknown level of brutality. In the Russian Civil War alone, I think there were almost 10 million dead.
Bürgerkrieg, glaube fast 10 Millionen Tote.
Displacement and the rule of terror become the order of the day, and starvation. People are uprooted and trapped between the fronts. The fear of the Bolshevist movement is ever present.
There is no longer an international law of war, and thus any level of violence can be employed.
In this time of chaos and destruction that seems to know no limits, an ancient phenomenon is reawakened in Eastern Europe. people need scapegoats that can be called to account for the catastrophe. The Jews.
The formation of a dangerous pattern of thought can be observed here. The idea that the Bolshevist revolution in Russia, but also communism in general, is a Jewish conspiracy, has its historic basis in the fact that many Jews living in Tsarist Russia saw Bolshevism as a liberating ideology.
Thus, the feelings of hatred from the First World War were mixed with hatred of the revolution and with the very, very, very old hatred of the Jews, which is why the violence inflicted on the Jews at the time was especially horrific.
And the Jews are not the only victims of the new levels of violence. Nationalists, Bolsheviks, ethnic minorities, all are sucked into a maelstrom of terror and counter-terror. The First World War continues in Eastern Europe, with victims on all sides.
Against this background, it is difficult to speak of 1914 to 1918 as the First World War, because in the years 1918 to 1923, estimated extremely conservatively, at least 5 million people die in military conflicts, revolutions and counter-revolutions. That's more than the combined loss of life for Great Britain, France and the USA in the First World War.
Poland, too, faces further armed conflicts after the end of the war. From 1919, the newly founded republic finds itself at war with Russia. Once again, it's a matter of territorial claims. The founder of the Polish state, Józef Pilsudski, sees the country's newly won independence under threat. The Polish-Soviet war is conducted with extreme brutality. Again, people die on both sides in a conflict marked by claims to power and nationalism. For Poland, it's a matter of survival for a sovereign nation. And they're prepared to make sacrifices.
The people have had enough of war and never want to experience one again. This is also true for the majority of the First World War veterans. But on the other hand, there are those who can't stop waging war. Everything is seen as a crisis, and if the nation seems in danger, even if it's not true, they're prepared to do anything to protect it.
The early years of Poland's new existence are marked by starvation, fighting, and death. In 1920, the Red Army is close to Warsaw. But the Poles manage a surprising historic victory. It goes down in history as the miracle on the Vistula and is celebrated with great pride. Even today, the anniversary of the victory on the Vistula is one of the most important events in Polish history to be celebrated and is part and parcel of the national consciousness.
It was Polish soldiers who defended Europe in those days against the Red Scourge. The bravery of the Polish soldiers, our great-grandfathers, prevented this catastrophe. It was a great battle, one of the biggest and most important in our history. It was our great victory.
I think for the nations of Eastern Europe who came out of the Soviet Empire, nationalism is freedom. But the trouble is nationalism has another side, and nationalism is also about defining yourselves and saying who belongs and who doesn't belong. It's about drawing lines. But nationalism is an enormously powerful and disruptive force.
This can clearly be seen on the march that marks Independence Day. Today, Poland is pursuing a nationalistic course which feeds on the experiences of the past. Nationalism has become socially acceptable again. The Conservative government has sworn that Poland will never again be subordinated.
Jest to wspaniałe święto, ponieważ
It's a wonderful holiday because we can really express our patriotism and our dedication to our fatherland.
Wenn Sie sich beispielsweise in Polen die Gedenkfeiern...
If you look at the state-run commemoration ceremonies in Poland, commemorating the end of the First World War, it's interesting to see that the focus is on the founding of the Polish Republic and the independence of the nation-state, while the First World War itself was for many years not in the spotlight.
an sich lange Zeit in den Hintergrund getreten war.
There are good reasons for this, because during the First World War, Poles often fought on different sides in three different armies: the Tsarist Russian army, the army of the Habsburg monarchy, and the German army. This memory is of course divisive, whereas the commemoration of 1918 and the moment of the foundation of the Republic should have a unifying effect.
Staatsneugründung vereinigend wirken soll. Das heißt also,
This means that they try and suppress a pluralistic discussion and instead invent a national feel-good commemoration.
Wohlfühlerzählung zu erfinden.
After Poland's victory over the Red Army, in 1921 the East European states agree a new peace treaty in Riga. A new order is created. While Poland is given large swathes of territory to the east, Ukraine loses the independence that was declared after the First World War. The country is divided up between Russia and Poland.
Und es beginnt das Zeitalter.
Thus begins the age of nation-states.
Diese Nationalstaaten auch nicht.
These states are not particularly ethnically homogenic, but are extremely intermixed,
Man kann diese neuen
which means that they can be compared to mini-empires, but without the centuries-old tradition and the knowledge of how to manage such ethnic diversity.
und das Wissen darum, wie man
This state of affairs brings with it unbelievable problems in the following period.
sich auch in der Folgezeit unglaubliche Probleme.
The collapse of the empires in the center of Europe and the establishment of all these different states, from Poland to Czechoslovakia to Yugoslavia and so on, meant that because of the mix of populations, something like a third of all the peoples living in the middle of Europe were minorities in the country in which they lived.
It was already clear to the Allies in Paris. This problem has to be solved. The victorious powers asked themselves at Versailles how they could make sure the rights of minorities would be respected, without becoming the stuff of future conflicts.
Die Alliierten dachten noch in Paris.
In Paris, the Allies thought that they had found a solution to the problem of ethnic conflicts in Eastern and Central Europe.
In Ostmitteleuropa gefunden hatten.
This took the form of the so-called Minorities treaties, probably the best thing to come out of Paris in 1919.
Vermutlich das Beste, was aus Paris 1919 hervorkam.
And so what the Allies were trying to do is ensure that there'd be protection for the various minorities, including the Jewish minorities, because there were huge Jewish minorities throughout a lot of the middle of Europe, of course, in Poland in particular. And so the minorities treaties were meant to protect minorities, give them certain rights, to be educated in their own language, for example, and to be able to go to court in their own language.
Das heißt also, jeder Nachfolgestaat.
This meant that every new state in Eastern and Central Europe, and there were a great deal of them, had to sign an agreement before they could be recognized internationally that guaranteed the rights of ethnic and religious minorities within the new state borders, and that these rights could be claimed internationally.
Dass diese Rechte auch international eingeklagt werden konnten.
There was a lot of resentment in countries such as Poland and Romania about having to sign these minorities treaties. And they said, with a certain amount of reason, why isn't Britain signing a minorities treaty to protect the Irish and the Scots?
This is both a political and an ethical contradiction. On the one hand, there are states that can do what they want, and then there are others that have to sign minority treaties.
Lviv, in modern Ukraine. At the time of the First World War, it was Polish territory. The urban image back then was that of a multi-ethnic city. One specific religious minority once again quickly became the focus of suspicion: the Jews. Soon there was no sign of any protective measures for minorities. Who was supposed to guarantee such protection? For the Polish government, the Jews were, above all, second-class citizens.
People feel there are too many minorities in Poland. They'd like to be alone among Poles and Christians. There are far too many Ukrainians. But above all, for the Poles, there are far too many Jews.
For the Ukrainians too, memories of this time are very fresh. They haven't forgotten their eventful history. And this period of Polish rule is just one of many moments of a tragic past. For the Ukrainian historian Taras Grivul, Polish governance left deep wounds.
One example is the schools. Back then, it was compulsory to learn Polish. In the meantime, Ukrainian national holidays were abolished, while Polish holidays were obligatory. This gradual assimilation then led to the Ukrainian schools being closed.
In what is today West Ukraine, a man is celebrated as a national hero upon whom the events of the time left their mark. For Russians and Jews, he is a criminal. His name? Stepan Bandera, a freedom fighter who didn't shrink from using violence. His whole life, Bandera fought for one thing, an independent Ukraine. His deeds are still firmly anchored in the consciousness of Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians.
Stepan Bandera was the son of a Ukrainian priest who preached in a little village. When he was still a boy, Bandera experienced the First World War and the nationalist movement, which ended in defeat. He had carried a feeling of injustice since childhood. There is scarcely anywhere in Ukraine that better represents the inner strife of a nation than the city that was once called Lemberg. This is reflected in the changing name of the city in the west of the country. The Austrian Lemberg gives way to the Polish Lviv until it is finally renamed the Ukrainian Lviv. The fight for independence is more present in the Galician metropolis than in almost any other Ukrainian city. Above all else stands the desire for a free, unified nation. As early as 1918, the Ukrainian independence movement sees the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy as a chance to claim Lviv for itself. For the first time, the dream of a nation-state seems within reach. The Republic is proclaimed, but the project is doomed to failure.
Ukraine had had much less independence in the past than Poland. I mean, there had been, I think, brief moments of independence, but it was not seen as a country with its own long separate history. And it was seen very much, I think, by outsiders as being part of Russia. And the Ukrainian language is very close to Russian, and a lot of Ukrainians were Orthodox like the Russians, although, of course, a lot were Catholic too. But I think that Ukraine just didn't have the international fame, for example, that Poland had. And it had no defenders in Paris. Nobody knew much about Ukraine. Nobody cared much about Ukraine.
The Republic does not last. Polish troops, under the command of the state founder Pilsudski, effortlessly occupy the western part of the country, while in the east the Red Army takes power. Ukraine, divided between west and east, a fate that runs through the history of the country like a leitmotif.
Basically, it looked as if many nations were able to achieve independence. Only the Ukrainians became victims of larger states. In Galicia, the disappointment was felt particularly strongly. The national revolution that had begun after the First World War had come to an end without achieving its goal, which meant that other activities were necessary. Other states were successful, but not Ukraine. In the 1930s, it is Stepan Bandera who continues the fight for freedom in the underground. The leader of the OUN, the name of his liberation army, is responsible for assassination attempts on Polish politicians. And his views on the Jewish population are equally merciless and radical.
As far as Bandera and his followers are concerned, the Jews have a certain responsibility for the destructive upheavals of the period.
After 1917, the nationalists repeatedly accused the Jews of being communist sympathizers. This is the cultural context in which people like Bandera grow up.
Bandera is arrested for his terrorist attacks in 1934 and sentenced to life in a Polish prison. But this is not the end of his fight for independence. In Germany, the National Socialists have taken power. 20 years after the end of the First World War, Europe is heading for the next catastrophe. One of the war aims of the Nazi leadership is the creation of Lebensraum, space to live, in the East. Hitler's invasion of Poland is the beginning of the greatest crime in history, the Holocaust. Bandera, however, senses an historic chance.
На початок Другої світової війни Степан Бандера сидів у
At the start of the Second World War, Bandera was in a Polish prison serving a life sentence.
Тобто досмертним присудом. І після
The prison was bombed by the German Luftwaffe, enabling him and others to escape.
Літаки, він разом з іншими ув'язненнями
This gave him the opportunity to find out about events in Lviv in September 1939.
інформацію про те, що діялося у вересні 1939 року. Цей час
The situation was as
виглядало
follows.
таким чином.
What is today West Ukraine was split between Nazi Germany and the Soviet
яка
Union.
поділена також договором між нацистською Німеччиною і
Once again,
Радянським
Ukraine was divided between two states.
І знову ж таки Україна опинилася розмінною картою між двома державами.
In 1941, Soviet-occupied West Ukraine is quickly overrun by the German army in Operation Barbarossa. Bandera and his units fight alongside the German army.
Pack hat Feindberührung. Bolschewistische MG und Packnester liegen unter dem Feuer der deutschen Waffen.
Collaborating with the Nazis was, from Bandera's point of view, a means to an end, an independent Ukraine.
І Німеччина на той час не була таким однозначним
Germany wasn't really viewed as an ally, but it was seen as the embodiment of European culture and European ideas.
втіленням якоїсь європейської культури і європейських ідей.
On the 30th of June 1941, the German army marches unopposed into Lviv. Large parts of the Ukrainian population see the Germans as liberators. After the civilian celebrations, the pent-up hatred towards the former Soviet occupiers erupts. The insignias of Stalin's rule soon disappear from the city. But it doesn't stop there. Accompanying the German army are two SS battalions called Roland and Nightingale. They are made up of members of Bandera's Liberation Army, the OUN. The events of the following hours have never become fully clear. It is, however, a fact that the city's Jews are relentlessly persecuted. More than 100 people are brutally put to death. Eyewitness accounts speak of Bandera's supporters being jointly responsible for torture and murder.
There is firm evidence that his troops had participated in genocidal attacks on the civilian Jewish population. This had become a terrible tradition in this region since the end of the First World War and the end of the Austro-Hungarian double monarchy.
Можливості навіть жодного факту побачити, який підтверджує
I'm not aware of any facts that prove a connection between Lviv and the Ukrainian nationalists who were part of Bandera's
до
OUN.
погромів, які відбувалися у Львові або в інших містах.
When we talk about ethnic Ukrainians and the pogroms in Lviv, we're talking about speculation and presumption.
Якісь групи, які української національності були, тут же ми входимо в тему, можливо, догадок, спекуляцій.
Just because someone says they were Ukrainian, it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually were.
Хтось називав себе там українцем, не факт, що він таким був.
This view is widely held in large parts of Western Ukraine. But was not the freedom fighter Bandera in truth an anti-Semite and murderer?
Bandera and his military units carried out massacres of Poles, massacres of Jews, and they collaborated with the Nazis. They were separate military units created when the Nazis invaded Ukraine. This is also part of the truth.
Dies gehört eben auch zur Wahrheit dazu.
Bandera's support for Nazi Germany has but one goal, the longed-for state of independence. Shortly after the pogroms of Lviv, Bandera's troops declare national sovereignty. But an independent Ukraine is far from the interests of the Nazis.
Zunächst mal muss man sagen, dass viele ukrainische Nationalisten.
First, one must establish that many of the Ukrainian nationalists have the wrong idea about what the Nazis have in mind for Eastern Europe.
Die Wehrmacht sozusagen durch Osteuropa marschiert.
The idea that the German army marched through Eastern Europe in order to help certain nations to independence is certainly a fundamental misunderstanding, because the Nazis think in racial terms.
In rassischen Kategorien.
And Slavic independence and statehood have absolutely no place in this thinking.
Hat in diesem Denken absolut keinen Platz.
Bandera is arrested and put in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. When the Red Army begins to push the German army back, Ukrainians fight against both Nazis and Russians. Bandera's resistance movement gets caught between all the fronts.
Bandera
propagated in all seriousness the idea that in order to achieve an independent Ukraine, as collaborating with the Nazis hadn't worked, one would have to take on both systems and fight against the Nazis on the one side, but above all against Stalin and the Red Army on the other.
Stalin und die Rote Armee auf der anderen Seite.
Bandera's followers, called Banderovцы, begin a bloody partisan war, which still has after effects in Russia and Ukraine today, in very different ways.
Stalin und sein Massenterror.
Stalin's rule of terror and the Red Army were arch enemies for Bandera and his partisans.
Todfeind und
and thus, this guerrilla war was fought relentlessly and mercilessly on both sides.
Partisanenkampf auf beiden Seiten gefochten.
And that's why, even today, Bandera and the Banderovцы are in the Russian consciousness, not just arch-enemies, but on a par with fascists.
Gleichgesetzt werden.
Bandera survives the war and goes into exile in Munich. He is murdered in 1959 by a KGB agent. In large parts of Western Ukraine, he is seen as a national hero and martyr. In 2010, he is officially honored by the Ukrainian parliament.
Für westliche Vertreter,
for Western representatives of the EU, but also, of course, for Russians, Bandera's elevation to the status of national hero is hard to bear.
Relativ schwer zu ertragen, und es gab ja auch.
And there were loud, strident protests at the time, which lasted until the official heroization was withdrawn.
Heroisierung dann auch zurückgenommen wurde.
Nevertheless, every year Ukrainian nationalists celebrate Bandera's birthday, as in 2019 in Kiev. For them, he remains their greatest freedom fighter and symbol against oppression and foreign domination. Criticism of their hero is out of the question for Ukrainian nationalists. But the wounds he caused are still felt today. In large parts of eastern Ukraine and in Russia, Bandera and his followers stand for murder, torture and fascism, and they turn up regularly on the political agenda.
The historical facts are unambiguous. Bandera's troops and other Hitler collaborators participated in the murder of Jews in Lviv, Odessa, Kiev and other cities in Ukraine.
Gaunt stone slabs at the site of the Lviv synagogue commemorate the fate of the Jews. At the end of the First World War, the city had a Jewish population of more than 100,000. Today, Jewish life has come to an almost complete standstill. More than 1 million Ukrainian Jews died during the years of Nazi terror. But here in this city, the name Bandera is indivisibly linked with the desire for freedom for the Ukraine. Just a few kilometers from the monument, a restaurant pays bizarre homage to the life and deeds of Stepan Bandera.
Password.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. This honey moonshine schnapps kills Russians like flies.
Let me try it.
Every guest has to undertake this ritual. The whole of Yurko Nazaruk's restaurant is designed to honor Stepan Bandera and his resistance movement.
Did Bandera kill Jews? I don't know. Did he ever kill anyone at all? I don't know. Is he branded a criminal and terrorist by Jews? I'm not sure. But Bandera was an excellent symbol, and back then he became the embodiment of Ukrainian independence. He led his nation in the fight for independence. That was it.
Ось і все.
With its warlike atmosphere, the restaurant Kryivka, or Dugout, is one of the most popular meeting places in the city. No one is bothered by the souvenirs of days long gone. On the contrary, behind the marketing concept stands an unshakable conviction.
It's important to underline that in Ukraine there is a misunderstanding about what is patriotism and what is nationalism. What we call healthy patriotism is if you love your country and you want it to be independent so you can build a life here. In parts of Ukraine, especially in the east, this is seen as radical nationalism. But that really isn't the case.
This contradiction again became clear in 2013 during the Maidan protests against the then pro-Russian government in Kiev and the upheavals in Ukraine that followed. In amongst the peaceful, freedom-seeking crowd, the black and red flags of the OUN could be seen. But for the majority of Ukrainians, it wasn't a right-wing nationalist event. When the protests turned violent, Russian media took the participation of Bandera sympathizers as proof that fascists wanted to take power in Ukraine.
We know that the events in Kiev have nothing to do with a fascist putsch. The right-wing nationalists, who one could in part call fascist, have been gaining in strength, and not just since 2013-2014. And this is also a part of the political development in the Ukraine. But it is far from being a situation where fascists are in power in Kiev. The opposite is the case.
Moscow, however, is exploiting this narrative. The annexation of the Crimea, which is against international law, was just the first step in the destabilization of Ukraine. Since then, in the east of the country, which is mostly inhabited by people of Russian origin, separatists have been fighting for secession from Kiev. Nearly 13,000 people have died since the conflict began. Ukraine is being torn apart again. The painstakingly achieved unity is in concrete danger, and at present there is no solution in sight. And the painful memories of the past are as present as ever.
Ukraine and Russia have a very complicated history, and for Ukrainian nationalists, 1918, that brief moment of independence, is an extremely important one, and one to which reference is often made in today's debates. The independence that was realized, but then eradicated by the Bolsheviks by force of arms.
You may not believe it, but there are a lot of parallels between today and 1918 and the years that followed. There is the same indifference on the part of the European countries to something that is happening elsewhere and not right on their doorstep.
To understand many of the political conflicts we see today in parts of Eastern Europe, for example Ukraine, you have to look back to the time of the First World War and the years thereafter.
At the peace negotiations in Paris, the victorious powers left Eastern Europe more or less to fend for itself. A decision that was to have dire consequences. Wilson's right to self-determination for nations led to a new nationalism, upheaval, and war. The supposed Peace of Versailles was the start of a whole series of conflicts in Eastern Europe.
Hier wurden neue Grenzen gezogen, entstanden neue
Here new borders were drawn and new states created with enormous potential for conflict, and which, if you look from 1918 up to today, keep coming up on political agendas.
In Ukraine, the bloody legacy of Versailles can still be felt today.